Cool. Take it from the top. We just have our app. Nice. Let's see what components it's rendering. It's rendering our header and our main container. So the header is just this loveliness with our React logo spinner that I just used with the burn book instead. If you watch the movie, you'll understand. You have to. It's a requirement. It's a lab. So it's rendering the header and the main container. So the header is just that information. If we check out main container is where we're keeping state. It's got the actual information about our contestants. State's structured a little different than you're used to seeing. Instead of just an array, it's an object of 1, 2, 3, like number keys pointing to the object of each contestant. So just keep that in mind. We have 2 of these functions, increase vote and decrease vote. So when we are clicking on a vote, these buttons are actually on the contestant component itself, but where the contestant's being held in our main container. So we need to have this callback function passed down through contestants, which is taking all of our contestants, those 2 functions. Let's see what that's doing. It's mapping over our contestants and creating a contestant card for each of those things and it's rendering it out. So is contestants even using those functions? No. Right. It's strictly just the need to have that prop being passed down to a deeper child. So it's actually here that every time we click on a button, we either increase the vote, or decrease the vote, or just sending over that contestant ID. Everyone's familiar with destructuring props? We talked about that, right? Cool. If you have any questions, let me know. But the image that's getting returned is really just dependent on the number of votes. And the number changes when we call these functions. Any questions about the setup right now? Cool. Completely functioning React app. We're going to turn it into a React Redux app. And what did we say Redux was? It's our state manager. Right, exactly. Right now, our state is being managed by React. And this is what we're going to want to change. So any starting point with getting Redux into a React app is we're going to, let me open a new tab. Does everyone know what yarn is? Okay, cool. So I'm going to use yarn right now so that I can simultaneously run my app and add, nope, get rid of this. Add the Redux library. So yarn add Redux. Nice. Why do we need Redux? Because we're taking our store from our React app and using Redux to be that state manager. What's the first step? Does anyone remember? What's that?
Just for like clarification about the state, there's not going to be any other state that's held in other components. It's all just going to be in the store.
For as much, so it's kind of like what we talked about, those guidelines. For the most part, you want to aim for that functionality, to have all of your state in your Redux, have Redux controlling all of your state. That doesn't mean we can't have state in our React components. We can totally do that. It'll still work, right? We're not breaking React by using Redux. It's just that now you have 2 places to look for information and you want to kind of avoid that. But in the case of a form or something where it's information not pertinent to your whole application, but you do need to change that information and maybe your form component needs to know about that information, that's okay for having that local React state, but you want to avoid it. That's a good question. So how do we interact with state? Do we interact with it directly?
No.
No, we don't. What do we interact with when using Redux?
The store.
Our store. Exactly. So first things first, we need to create a store. So we're going to import create store, which is a function, and it comes from our Redux library. I'm going to store this thing. So what create store returns is the store we just created. Cool. Let's try this out. Nope, wrong way. is it? What does it say?
Expected reducer to be a function.
Yeah, expected reducer to be a function. Where is it erroring?
When we create
Line
the
8.
store.
Yeah, when we create the store. Because what's the whole point of Redux? To have state, right? It's our state manager. Whose job is it to return state? The reducer. Exactly. The reducer is a thing that returns new state, right? A return state. That's how we get state in regards to our store. So create store takes in a reducer as an argument. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new file. Call the reducer. And what did we say the reducer was? Just a function. What does it take in? Does anyone remember?
The state and the action.
And an action, right. The state being the previous version of the state, and the action being the set of instructions and information we need to make this new state. Right now, when we first start off our application, we don't really care about the action. We just want to think about an initial version of state, kind of like what you think about your React state. Like, what's my initial structure of my state going to look like? It's kind of like what we're starting here. But the purpose of the reducer is to return state, or that new state. But right now, we're going to return state. We talked about the reducer using something called the switch statement. Everyone knows what that does. Depending on this condition or whatever's in this thing, we're going to return a different kind of state, right? And what are we going to switch on? What is an action, first off?
Object.
Action is an object. It's got a type. The type is telling us the instruction on what we're doing when returning that new state. So first things first, we don't really have an action type yet, right? But we want to catch any default, like what if we send the wrong action? We want to make sure that our reducer is always returning some version of state. So we have this default, which is going to just return state here. Is everyone clear on that? Anyone have any questions about switch statements? Well, this will make a lot more sense when we're actually using these actions. But the whole point is we need to have a function whose job it is to return state. If I want to use code somewhere, I have to make sure that I export it. Let's export default. I'm going to import it here. Cool. Nice. It's not breaking anymore. Let's just console log our store. How can we see what our state looks like? Does anyone remember? Can I just say store.state?
No.
What do I want to say?
Get state.
There's a function on the store called getState that we can use just to see our initial state. Undefined. Oh, I called it store, I'm sorry. Undefined. We didn't give it any state to deal with, right? So typically, in my reducer, I'll define some initial state that I want. State is just an object, right? What do we want our state to look like? Where can we look? We already have state in our app.
Yes.
Right. When we're taking a React app and turning it into Redux, the way we want to structure our React state is exactly kind of the way we want to think about structuring our Redux state. It's just an object that has the information we need. And right here, we have that information, right? Like, this is what I want my state to look like. I just need an object with contestants and have those contestant information. So I'm just going to copy that over here. If we weren't doing this from scratch, which we'll do an example of that next week, you just want to think about what is the empty structure of your React state what your app state should look like. What information am I going to need in my app? That's how you start structuring your objects. Cool. So I'm going to provide this state as a default argument. Like, unless I pass in state, use the initial state. All right, now let's check it out. Our store is our object with dispatch, get state, all of those functions that we use to interact with our state. And our state are those contestants. I just want to be clear right now. There is nothing going on with this state and my React app. I can comment this out. My React app still works. And they're not dependent on each other, right? Right now, they're two totally different things. But if I do this, everything breaks. And that's where we're going to get to. Just as a side note, if you want to use Redux in an app, I wouldn't advise starting it in React and then implementing Redux. It's just going to make life a lot harder for you. I suggest starting with Redux. And the reason why is just the wiring that we talked about in the beginning. And that's what we're going to talk about now, is the wiring. We have these components, right? And now state lives in this other place, in this store. We need a way for our store to communicate with our React app. Redux needs to talk to React. So that's where our React Redux library comes in. So we need to make sure we add React Redux. That's going to help us with this linking between these two libraries. So I need to give my store to my React app. How do we give information or send information? In React. In React. How do we get information to components? Through props, right? So let's think about this really quick. What React Redux gives us is this provider Does anyone know what the provider is? Why is there a capital letter on it? Go for it.
Oh, I'm not sure. What is a capital letter on it?
It's a component. Yeah, I mean, it's not that's not why there's a capital letter, but I mean, it's a signifier. We need to get some information from our React store our Redux store into React, right? So what React Redux gives us is this component that's going to wrap our whole application, which is called the provider. And what is it providing? The store. So it kind of looks like props, the way we send props, right? It's a component that's going to wrap our app, and it's going to provide the store. Cool. Let me go into my main container now, just so things don't break for a quick second. And then I go into my app. Let's console log this. What do we see? Are we getting that store? No, right? We're not getting that store. So what the provider does is allows us to communicate with the store, but there's an extra step to wiring our components to actually know about that store and use that store in the way we want. So let's think about this for a second. Let's take a step back. We have our provider, we're providing our store. What components actually care about the information that's in our Redux store? Does our header care?
No.
No. So does that mean our app cares? Does the app care about that information? That contestants information?
I mean, if it's not passing it to main container, then no.
Right, this component, app is its own component. It's not using contestants information. It's not making a change to contestants information. App doesn't need to know about this store, right? Neither does the header. The header doesn't need to know about this store. It doesn't have any way to communicate with this thing, or it doesn't need any way to communicate this thing. How about main container? When I get rid of this, what happens? Oop. It breaks. But does main container need to know about the information in our state?
No.
No, right? It was here so that we can make some changes and pass that information along. But who really cares about this information? The contestant card. Cool. So I'm going to do something really quick. I'm going to leave those things in, but I'm not going to pass this through. A lot of things are going to break. Just bear with me really quick. So it breaks because we need to know about contestants. So we have contestant card. I'm sorry. We have contestants. We have our store. And the store is part of which library? Redux. And our component is which library? And I'm trying to get the two things to talk together, so which library am I going to use?
Redux,
React Redux. Yeah. You don't have to memorize this. It's just these are helpful tips and tricks when I'm building this out. Like, okay, and instead of looking this up, here's what am I trying to use this thing for? So I'm trying to link or connect my store to my component. So what React Redux gives us is this connect from React Redux. Again, so things don't break. I'm gonna comment this out really quick. Actually, yeah, let me comment that out really quickly. Cool. Let's just console log this connect thing. Let's see what it is. Connect. Oops. Connect is just a function. It takes in 3 arguments. We really just care about the first 2. We'll talk about the third one, but you don't frequently use it. It's a function that takes in map state to props, maps dispatch to props, and merge props. Let's talk about the map state to props and map dispatch to props. What do we say dispatch is used for?
For binding, for allowing actions or functions that we create to talk to this reducer.
To the reducer. Right. So when we want to make a change, right, we need dispatch because in order to make a change, we need to dispatch an action to the reducer. Does a contestant component care about making a change?
No.
No. This is a little deceiving to handle increase vote, decrease vote. That's just leftover code from our regular React app. But this component only needs to know about contestants, so it can render those contestants on the page. It's not making any changes. It just needs to access some information. So that's when we're going to talk about something called map state to props. Really quickly, connect is a function that returns a function. And what that returned function takes in is the component itself. So this is going to take some arguments, map state to props, map dispatch to props. We said, since this component doesn't care about making a change, we probably don't need to use map dispatch to props here. We really just want to talk about this map state to props thing. What map state to props is a function as well. It takes in this argument. And then connect takes that map state to props function as its first argument. Let's talk about this in a second. Okay, so we see that we're console logging there on line 33 in our contestants. Line 33. What does that look like? What is that mystery argument? State. The state, right? The store is what allows us to talk to this state, but this is actually the state itself. It's an object with our contestants in it. They did not name this by accident. State. Again, is this something that was provided to us, or did we define this? We defined it. I can call this dogs. Map dogs to props. I can call this dogs. Call this dogs. Still getting contestants, right? Because that's just JavaScript. I've defined a function. As long as it's being used where it's expected to be used as this first argument, connect is actually the thing that's going to feed us this state, right? So calling it map state to props, that's convention. That's just because it makes the most sense, right? But you can call it whatever you want as long as you use it the right way. Does anyone have any questions about that so far? Again, they didn't name this by accident. The purpose of this function is to return what you want your new props for this component to look like. And what did we say this component needs to know about? The contestant. Right. So I'm going to structure an object that's going to be sent to my component. I'm just going to call this key contestants because that makes the most sense. And I'm going to use state.contestants so that it gives me that information. Cool. So map state to props is a function whose job is to return what the props that we want to send to this contestant or to whatever component is using that. So map state to props, contestant. It's console log props here. What are we getting?
Everything we need.
Contestant. What else are we getting?
Getting the increase mode and the decrease mode. We're getting everything.
We're getting everything. So not only are we getting props from Redux, from our state, right? We're not getting it from main container anymore. We commented that information out. We removed it. But what are we sending to contestants? Those callbacks, right? We're still getting, again, this is just to reiterate, every act doesn't break. We can still pass props down, right? Contestants still gonna get these props, but it's also gonna get the props coming from our Redux store. Does contestant need these things anymore now that we're not changing state here? No, probably not. So let's go ahead and comment those out. For the sake of not breaking, this doesn't need to happen anymore either. Cool. I'm going to comment this back in. Now that we're getting contestants as props, right? This whole map contestants is still going to behave the same. Is still going to behave the same way, right? as long as it gets props that points to that object with the contestant's information, this is going to work. Nice. I know it's not that well named, but we just use Redux, right? We're rendering part of our state onto our React, and through our React app. We're still, again, passing down props the old-fashioned way, right? Contestant card is still getting every single contestant. But now we just skipped that step of having main container know about the contestant, since it really doesn't need to know about that information. We're going straight to the component that cares. Cool. So let's go ahead and think about the rest of this. So this is going to break, right? We have to handle for these button clicks. Who cares about the button clicks? Contestants or contestant card?
The card.
The card, right? And what do we need to do when a contestant gets clicked? When vote gets clicked or when unvote gets clicked?
Change the state.
We need to make a change to state. Exactly. And it's this component that's going to be in charge of making a change to state. It's not necessary for our other components to do that. The change that's getting triggered is triggering right here in the card itself, right? So we need to talk to our store directly. We need to make a change to state. We know we don't change state unless we go through our store. And how do we do that? We follow this lovely circle we have on the board. We need to dispatch an action, hit our reducer, and have it return that new state. Apologize. Cool. Does this, first things first, we need to connect this component, right? We need to interact with our store by making a change to state. So I need to import connect. And what did I need to use this connect for? It takes two arguments, map state to props that we just went over. What is map state to props useful for? Do we need any part of state right now?
Need the votes to change.
We need the votes to change. Do we need the actual votes though? Are we rendering that information already?
Yeah. You just need to be able to change it.
Right. All the information we need to be rendered is already on the page, right? We don't need to access any part of our state. We've already connected state to our app, right? The contestants part of our state to our app. We're rendering those contestants. Contestant card there is no other part of state right now, but imagine if there was. Contestant card doesn't need any more information. It's already receiving that information as props from the contestant's container component, right? But it does need to make a change. So do we need map state to props? No, we don't. Cool. But we do need that second argument, which is map dispatch to props. Round two. I have to connect it, so connect is a function that takes in map state to prop and map dispatch to props. And it returns a function that takes in the component we want to connect. Since we don't need the first argument, we need to make sure we're keeping that placeholder there. We need to map dispatch to props. Cool. What do we see that mystery arg is? It's in the name, folks. Dispatch. Again, not named by accident. I can totally rename this function to whatever I want. But yes, what's getting fed in by connect is dispatch. we want to dispatch an action in this component. Cool. Let's keep this in mind for a second. It returns exactly what map states to props returns, an object that's going to be sent to our component as props, right? So we're accessing this information through props. Contestant ID. Let's think about this for a second. I'm going to make this a... When someone clicks, the whole idea is we want to dispatch an action. Because we want to make a change to state. Let's think about how we want to structure that action. What does it need to know about? What makes an action valid? What is an action? It's a plain object that has a type, right? So we need a type. We can call this type whatever we want, right? At increase vote. And if we think about how we need to change our state, what piece of information do you think is going to be useful? And we can, if it helps, we can check out the other increase vote, decrease vote functions that we have in our main container. I just commented them out. We need some way to know which contestant's vote we're going to increase and decrease, right? So we need the contestant ID. How can I let my action know or load up my action with this information? So we have the type, that's the instructions. The payload, is the information. I'm going to say the payload is going to be an object with an ID. And where do I have ID right now? Contestant ID. Contestant ID. Cool. So this is just the structure of what I want my action to look like. But imagine I wanted to use this action, I wanted to increase the vote on multiple components. I don't want to keep constructing this action and writing out this object every time. So we're going to use something called action creators, which are just functions who are going to return these actions for us. They're literally just creating these actions. So I'm going to create a new folder, actions. I'm just going to create a new file where I'm going to keep these actions, creators. I'm just going to copy this information. Okay, clearly there's something wrong here, right? I don't have what piece of information.
What that does.
The contestant, yeah, I don't have the contestant ID in this function, right? Because now I'm in a different file. So I need to make sure I'm getting this ID to this function. So I'm going to make sure that it takes in the contestant ID. And I'm going to use that here, right? So I want to use this function in my contestant card. So that means I have to import that thing. And in order to import, I want to export, so I have to go back and export. So import increase vote from actions. Because it's an index file, if I reference a folder and I'm trying to pull something out of a folder, it'll immediately look to the index file. So I'm going to export this thing. Just a quick tip. You can't export default constants, but you can export constants. So if you're ever trying to understand why that happens, it's just, yeah. But you can export default classes inline. So I'm just going to export this constant increase vote. Importing it here. Okay, on click, I want to increase vote and send it my contestant ID. Let me get this ready, this thing for a second. Oh, thanks. Yep. Nothing's happening. Am I hitting that function? Let's find out. Just console. So I am hitting that function. But why is nothing happening? It's not doing anything. Let's go ahead and do the other part of that. Let's put our case statement. I'm telling it a set of instructions. The point is I want my action to switch on that type. So let's go ahead and increase vote here. Nice. Let's just console log hitting the reducer. And for right now, I'm going to return state for right now. How many people think I'm going to see the hitting the reducer? I'm not. Why?
We didn't break. If we're in a switch, don't we need to tell it to break out of the switch?
That's only if we don't use the return, right? But we're not actually even hitting this statement, our increase vote action type. It's not even registering that.
We never.
Let's actually,
That.
what? I think
We
you're
never
there.
connected the thing that's returning that action to the dispatcher.
Right. We're not even, so we hit it once to get that initial state. We're never hitting the reducer. That's because we never dispatched that action. The action creator is just a function who's going to return a plain object. That's all it is. I'm returning a plain object. That's all that's happening. I actually need to get this plain object to our reducer. And that's where we're coming back in with this map dispatch to props. I need to dispatch this increased vote with the contestant ID, right? This is just responding to the function we've imported. Does anyone have any questions about that before I move on? All right, let's get into the dispatch, map dispatch to props. Takes in dispatch as an argument. So I need to structure this as the props that are going to be sent over. I can call this key, whatever I want. But what I'm aiming to do is I need to send my component this dispatched version of my action creator that I actually want to use, right? I need to dispatch that thing in order for it to hit my reducer and actually trigger some change in state. So I'm going to call this key dispatched increase vote. Which is going to point to a function that's going to use dispatch. And it's going to call that increase vote function who returns that object, right? It expects ID, so that means that this dispatched increase vote function should take in an ID. I can call this whatever I want. I'm just defining a function, right? This function should receive this argument and it should use that ID and that increase vote. So this is what we want to have happen. Does anyone have any questions about this? Just about what I did. I'm just defining a function that's wrapping the dispatched version of my action. So it's loaded up and ready to go when I actually want to make a change. So I go ahead and come in here and I console log. We see that we have that dispatched increase vote key coming through as props, which is pointing to that function that we defined. Sweet. Let's actually use that thing. So instead of calling increase vote, I really want to be calling my dispatched version, which we just saw is coming from props with that contestant ID. Nice. Now how many people think that we're going to hit our reducer and see that case hit? We are. We're dispatching an action. We're hitting the reducer. Obviously that information is not changing on the page because what's our reducer actually doing?
Nothing.
Nothing. It's just returning that old state. I'm going to quickly grab this function, just this part. I'm going to use that here as a guideline. Purpose of reducer, to return a new version of state. It's got to be a pure function, so I want to return a new object. I wanted to have all the keys that my previous state had, right? Like I don't want to be changing anything, but more specifically, I want to be changing this information. I want to be changing contestants. Let me get this out of here. I want to return a new object with a contestant's key that points to an object. Do I have this dot state anymore? No, I just have state. I'm going to use this. Spread out the contents of my contestant's object. Find the contestant ID. Do I have this contestant ID thing here?
In the payload.
I do have it in the payload. Absolutely right. If we were to console log this action really quickly, we could see that our payload has a key of ID that actually points to the contestant ID. So I'm going to use action.payload.id. And I need to reference it again here, action.payload.id. So what that's doing is use the ID. So if I clicked on 2, which would be Gretchen, it's going to say add a key of 2, create this new object, which is the contents of Gretchen's information, but change the votes key to increase by 1. There's a lot of spreading out, a lot of making sure we're not destructively changing state. That's because objects, even as keys, are still points in memory, right? So if it's a deep nested object that has other object as values, we need to make copies of those objects. That's all that's happening. It's just me making a bunch of copies. This is, a lot of people think they're kind of stuck doing this logic in the actual state itself. I'm not. I can do my logic here and then piece together the state as long as this case statement returns the object that I've constructed. Does that make sense? Like I have this space to work with if it helps. You're not confined to doing all of your copying inside of your return. Does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions about like the spread operator and why I'm doing all of that? The same way we'd kind of treat React state and how when we call set state, like changing that information, it's kind of the same idea, except Redux doesn't do the top level keys for us like React does. Cool. So I need to return this thing.
Still have this and notes.
Oh, thank you. Good eye, good eye. Nice. Nice. This is not magic, right? There's a re-render on the page, and we see those votes increasing because how are our contestant cards getting that information? Through props. Because we changed state, the component, our contestant's component that's getting that state as props is changing, right? Props are changing. A re-render is going to happen, all right? React and break. The life cycles still remain the same. It doesn't care where it's getting its props from. It just cares that it's getting props, and when it gets new props, it knows to re-render. Cool. That seems awesome and great. Let's do the same thing for the decrease vote. Dispatched decrease vote. So decrease vote is going to kind of look the exact same. We need to dispatch a decrease vote. Let's instead of getting to this point, let's actually create our action that we care about. Put this out here for a hot sec. Then we go into our actions, export this action creator, which is going to create my decrease vote action. It also needs to know about which contestant are decreasing. So this information is going to look pretty much similar. The only thing I need to change is what? The type, right? I don't want the same logic to happen when I press the decrease button as the same logic that happens when I press the increase button. I need to change the type. Decrease. Cool. So let's go ahead in our reducer. Ugh, sorry guys. Its job is to return state. Let me just do this. The only difference is instead of adding one, we're subtracting one. Nice. Who's using this function or this action that I just created? The contestant card, right? I can't just call decrease vote. I need to dispatch my decrease vote. So I need map dispatch to props to create a function that takes in an ID. It's going to dispatch decrease vote with that ID. Okay, and where do we want to actually use this? Here. So how am I going to reference that? Props. This, again, map dispatch to props, is giving us props for that component that's wrapped. Cool. Oh. I didn't call it. Right. Okay. Awesome. We've fully implemented Redux. Take it in. Take a second. That was a lot. I'm going to go through some quick shortcuts, tips and tricks on how to get better error messaging. But all that happens is that same flow. It's a lot of wiring up, a lot of determining which components need to interact with our store, how they need to interact with our store. But as long as we understand that it's really just a simple flow of information, it's a lot less intimidating than it actually seems. Does anyone have any questions, comments, concerns before I move on?
So, is it convention to have it in like the store, have it in index, or can you make like a separate file for it?
You could totally make a separate file for it as long as where we're creating the store and that whole configuration of the store can happen in a separate file as long as we are importing it and sending it to the provider, giving the provider our store. So yeah, you'll see a lot of configure store files that returns the store, returns this function that'll create the store for you and has that logic somewhere else. Good question.
And see how we initially has props down to the contestants card.
Sure. So it's kind of like a two-parter, right? We need to map state. We need to map state to props our contestants component, right? Like our contestants component, the thing that's going to iterate through each of our contestants and actually generate a contestant card. That component needs that information, right? It needs to communicate with our state somehow. So we need to map state to props this component. Really quickly, on line 28, that's the end of our React code, right? Line 36 and on is totally separate from our component. This is like the Redux stuff, this is the React stuff. It's just easy to keep them in the same file because I know which kind of things are linked, right? So really quick, I'm gonna export default contestants the way we normally export a component. Comment this out really quick. In our main container, I'm rendering contestants. All right. Let me console log contestants here really fast. Not contestants, the thing. So we see contestants. It's still a component, right? Like we didn't. Again, there's no breaking of React, but we don't want this regular contestants component. We want the connected version. We want to be using that. That's why we export default this connected version. Let me comment this out. I can split this up on 2 lines, right? I can say const connected contestants. I can't call it the same thing since this is called contestants. Actually, since it's just a function, I'm going to say let me switch this really quick. That's fine. Oop. It's read only, so it was cleared. Alright, let me call this connected contestants. Connected contestants, and I want to use that in my main container. So no longer am I importing contestants. I can keep them called the same thing, but just for clarity of this example,
Some were connected and some were connected.
Yeah.
oh, okay. Nope. Oh man. Right. Took a little bit. But what connect does after calling connect with map state to props and map dispatch props, returns that function that takes in a component. It returns the connected version of the component. So it's the connected version of the component that we're actually rendering on the screen, right? We don't want to use the regular unconnected version anymore. That's why you'll see this export default and then the connected all in one line, because the return of that connect is going to be that connected component. So let me go ahead and switch that back so we can see that. Connected contestants, let's get this out of here. Those two things are different. I'm exporting two different things on line 37 and line 38. So we're clear about that. Go for it.
So what if you have like an external component from some package? How exactly would you wrap it into that?
That's a good question. You would, if you import that thing, you could probably just connect. I'm not sure how as long as it's getting the props that it needs, that component's getting the props that it needs. I mean,
Well, let's say you have a container for that external component, and you want to change the state of the external component that is inside the container. How would you?
So it's still that component again. Like you could send it props, right? As long as the container that's wrapping your imported component from whatever library, as long as we're connecting that container, it's going to get our state information as props, and then we can go ahead and send props down again, right? We can do that just fine. Kind of going back to Tez's question, we're passing down contestants as props. We're connecting this state to contestants, but we're still passing down props to the contestant card the old school way, right? I'm still referencing props here to get all the contestants that I need to show up on the screen. So I'm still just passing props like normal. Yeah, go for it.
Can you still pass down ref the same way? Like if I wanted to use ref on like a child component, but I want to call it from the parent component.
Yeah, I think nothing's breaking, right? It's just where is this information coming from? According to like this component, nothing weird is happening. If I would just look at this, it's just getting props, right? It doesn't know where it's getting props, but it doesn't ever really know where it's getting props from some kind of other component, right? So according to my React, everything's still functioning just fine. It's just where is it getting this information that's changed. So the information itself hasn't changed. So we're still going to use React the same way. Good question. Anybody else before we go delve a little deeper? Go for it.
So is there like a thing called like combine reducers?
Yes, we'll talk about that next week. What the combine reducer does in an overview, if your state becomes really big, imagine having a reducer, a case statement for every single possible change you wanted to make for state. This file will get really big, right? If you can compartmentalize your states as like main components of the state, like, okay, I have a component, a part of my state that's just contestant related, a part of my state that's just votes related, let's say, or something like my state's growing. I'd want a different file for each of these, or a different function to handle for these different parts of my state. They're going to eventually come together as one big state, and that's what the combine reducer does. It's using all these mini reducers that we're going to make for one big state.
So it'll be like multiple keys pointing to different reducers?
Exactly.
Okay.
That's exactly what's happening as part of one overall big object. But we'll touch upon that and see an example of that next week. Okay. So to jump back in that map dispatch to props, I can totally name this key whatever I want. I'm going to call this increase vote, decrease vote. Okay. They're just keys on an object that I'm creating, not increase vote, I'm sorry, decrease vote. Keys on an object that I'm creating. I can call those keys whatever I want. So I'm going to call this increase vote. gonna call this decrease vote. Nice. P dot contestant is not. Where did it say
Oh,
that?
in the map, there was a P.
Oh, thank you. Yep. P. Okay. Nice. This should still work, right?
No,
What'd I do?
you killed the props.
I killed the props. Right. I'm still hitting that function. I didn't do anything. It's just JavaScript. I said when I click this button, I'm going to call that increase vote function. When I click the decrease vote button, I'm going to execute this decrease vote function, which are just functions. They're going to react like functions. They're going to execute. They're going to console log because this one's console logging. I see those console logs, but I'm not hitting my reducer. So up here is where I'm using these action creators, those functions, and that's the increase vote that I'm calling down here, but it's actually our props that have the dispatched version of that function. So we need to make sure that we're using props that increase vote. That's totally different than just increase vote by itself, right? Props.decrease vote is that dispatch, this whole thing is now what that's pointing to. Does that make sense? This works. Go for it.
And we would never have to worry about using like this and things again, because it doesn't seem to matter whether it's a function or if it's a class component.
So the way we structure our components is still the same. Like if we wanted to use lifecycle methods,
I mean,
And-
just in regards to the props, like how it has them down.
yeah,
It's
like
not props, it's just props, depending.
right. The way that props are what's coming through as props is the only thing that's changing, right? This is a React thing. If we're using a class base, we have this as that's the only way we access props is through this dot props. If we're using a functional base, we're still getting props. We still have to treat it the same way. You'll realize though, because we don't need to store state, and because we don't need that information anymore, you can make a lot more components functional. Doesn't mean you have to. If you still need lifecycle methods, you still need class-based components, we're still going to get props. Good question though. If you still need to just keep some local state, you still need to make it a class-based component.
So basically without props, you're getting to like the original state, right? That's why it's not changing. I mean, you like without the props on the functions.
Oh, the reason why it's not changing is because the only way to trigger a change is to dispatch an action, right? And to have the reducer make that new state. I'm triggering a function, but that function, all that function is doing is returning an object. That's it. Like, big whoop, I have an object, great. But the whole point is we need to get that object, that action, to our reducer in order to initiate some change. So there's actually no interaction with state at this very point. Whenever I click those buttons, there's no interaction with state, there's no interaction with store, there's nothing, right? It's when we use the dispatch that's bringing that action to our reducer, the reducer is going to return new state and deliver that new state to our store. Cool. Any questions about that? I'm about to make things a lot easier. If you have the key of the dispatch version of your action creator and you're going to call them the same thing, you can look into this more. It's something behind the scenes is going to happen. It's called the bind action creators. I think that's what it's called. If we pass in the actions that we want to bind or dispatch, the actions that we're trying to dispatch to our in place of our map state to props, our map dispatch to props. Let's check out line 8. We're still getting those increased that are those dispatched versions of our functions. So it's like a shorthand. If you don't want to write out your map dispatch to props, and you're going to call those keys the same eventually, and you don't need to do any other logic, you can just pass these functions through in place of your map dispatch to props. But this is actually what's happening behind the scenes, right?
So like, would you recommend like writing it out if it's like a more complex application?
I would write it out if there's additional logic that you need to do. Imagine like I needed to do something to the ID, or something needs to happen before I do send back that dispatch version of that function. Then yeah, I want to use map dispatch props. As long as I feel like you understand what's happening here before you try using this.
Is that working on line 50, like, it knows that it's gonna, whatever the key is, it's gonna pass a function with the same name as that key to dispatch
Yeah,
for
it's
the
so
value?
what these two things are the actual functions that we've imported.
Mm-hmm.
So it's saying, okay, take these functions, do what they're supposed to do, but have dispatch attached to them. Dispatch is getting back to those.
Okay, so, for convention, would you have an actions folder with the same name as like, your component, and just like everything goes for each component, you have a bunch of actions?
So the point of action creators, that's a great question. There's no real organization guidelines and structures. It's whatever really feels right to you. If I'm looking for all my information, look here. Actions that have to do with to-dos, look here. I wouldn't go based by component, because the point of the action creators is so we can use those actions in multiple places. Imagine you had like to add a to-do in this component, but also another component. So I'd probably avoid component, like single component based. If you wanted to do themes, like anything that had to do with adding, updating, or deleting a to-do or contestant, maybe have a file for like contestant actions. That could totally be fine. It's really whatever feels best for you in terms of code structure when it comes to Redux. Even React for that matter. It's really, you're the designers. You get to do what you want, as long as you know why. Alright.
As long as what you want to do isn't.
Cool. Why would I not want to do this?
Ooh,
Because I've seen people do that.
no.
Right.
They'll think that it's trying to map props.
Yeah, it's going to think we're trying to map state to props, right? JavaScript is still the same. It expects the first function to take in state, expects the second function to take in dispatch. So we need the null in there if we're not using map state to props. It's not the same if it's the first argument. We don't need a second argument, right? JavaScript. It's wonderful. Cool. Last thing. Imagine I spelled in crace. Oh, let me get rid of this. Imagine that wasn't there. Cool. In my mind, I'm going to go crazy and be like, why is this not working? Everything looks great. I have my action. I'm dispatching it, right? It's hard to spot typos in a string. Yes, the case statement's never getting hit because it's looking for the string that it doesn't know about. So it's going to return the default, right? The previous state. So a lot of times you'll see people reference types as constants. So I'm going to call this types.js. Let me take this. Oh, wrong way. And they'll turn their strings into constants. And they'll import them here, like wherever they're being used, instead of referencing strings. That way, if we ever make a typo somewhere, our error messaging is going to be a lot more precise. Instead of just failing silently and giving us the old version of state, it's actually going to say this thing that you're trying to use is not defined, right? So you'll see this a lot. But that's all. It's more for better error handling. It's not going to give you anything special. And then you can go ahead and in your reducer actually import that thing as well if you want to go double layer protection on typos. I could switch this to use my type instead, my type constant. Cool, that's just a little tidbit. If you see it in the tutorials, you see it in the docs, that's all it is. Okay, that's it for today's lecture. For this weekend, we are going to deploy a bunch of labs. Don't feel like you need to complete all of them. Work at your own pace. You are now the steerers of your own ship, right? However you work best or learn best is up to you. It's great. So we're going to try and send out as many resources that work around that. So we're going to send out videos. There's about 20 videos. Not that I did. Someone else did. On Redux. Understanding Redux, the nitty-gritty, it breaks down each part that you can learn better through videos. There's going to be the Redux docs, which are my favorite thing. They're really helpful. There's this basic section we're going to send the link out to. It's basically a tutorial on how to get a React Redux to-do list working. So if you want to try that over the weekend and just implement React Redux, go for it. I think that's helpful. Or you have the labs to do it yourself if you want to do those as well.
Do you feel like doing a lot